Channel's Weekend Review. How a distance of 600 feet is shaking up the Jewish world, a disease going undiagnosed for many Jews, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Weekend Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Weekend Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. A great amount of discussion in Jewish life these days is concentrated in a distance of just 600 feet in the Bronx, New York. There, two synagogues and two rabbis are shaking up the Jewish world in entirely different ways and for largely different reasons. We've reported in recent weeks about the revelations in a New York Times article about Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblatt of the Riverdale Jewish Center. Rosenblatt has, over the years, asked numerous men in his congregation and elsewhere to join him in saunas or steam rooms, and that they do so fully nude. For a period between 1986 and around 1993, Rosenblatt did the same with boys in his congregation before being told by his board to stop. Though the actions described by the Times were mostly known to great quantities of people in his synagogue, rabbinic leadership, and the larger community, the prominent revelations, as well as some details many did not know, led to a question of whether Rosenblatt would stay. A vote of the synagogue's board was reportedly overwhelmingly in favor of buying out Rosenblatt's contract, but the rabbi announced in a speech to the congregation Wednesday that he has every intention of staying on as a rabbi. The rabbi's speech was reportedly met with applause, including from some who stood up to applaud. Among the authorities who knew about Rosenblatt's behavior beforehand and chose not to ask him to stop it was the Rabbinical Council of America, or RCA, the largest Orthodox body of rabbis in the country. Just 600 feet away as the crow flies, and across a highway that serves to illustrate an ideological divide in Orthodox Judaism, Rabbi Avi Weiss of the Riverdale Jewish Center has announced he is no longer a member of the RCA, citing the fact that graduates of his seminary, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, have not been admitted as members of the rabbinical organization. Weiss founded Yeshivat Chovevei Torah more than a decade ago, and the dozens of graduates of the school have only been recognized by the RCA when they've received supplementary ordination elsewhere. Partly as a response to that, and partly as a response to issues around conversion and gender matters in Orthodoxy, Weiss had previously helped launch a more liberal rival to the RCA, the International Rabbinical Fellowship, or IRF, which seems to have a membership around a quarter of the size of the RCA. Weiss has at least some coattails here. Rabbi Shmuel Hertzfeld of Ohev Shalom Synagogue in Washington, D.C. has quit the RCA in response to Weiss's announcement. In all, the divide between the communities Weiss and Rosenblatt occupy, and between Weiss's rabbinical school and that of Yeshiva University, as well as between the IRF and the RCA, has long suggested a schism in Orthodox Jewish life. It's a schism that, in this week's announcements, becomes even more apparent. It's a schism that exists not just because the crowd that Weiss has led leans in a more liberal direction, but also because, unlike most other portions of Orthodox Judaism, Weiss and his adherents have been willing to draw a line to their right and criticize those beyond it from the perspective of Jewish values. Modern Orthodoxy generally, including that within Yeshiva University, has consistently and persistently declared no interest in drawing a line to its right, even as more right-wing versions of Orthodoxy have clearly drawn a leftward line that excludes a university education and education in the sciences and more. As the map of the Jewish future gets drawn in the decades to come, this small distance between two synagogues will be an ever greater part of the discussion. Moving on, a disease affecting many in the Jewish community can easily go undiagnosed, as Meredith Gansman reports.
There are 16 Jewish genetic diseases, the most well-known being Tay-Sachs disease. However, of these disorders, Gaucher disease is actually more common among Ashkenazi Jews and more initially misdiagnosed. One such patient was Tamara Siasi.
Consistently throughout my childhood, there was a large spleen, large liver, low platelets, bone pain, and abnormal labs. There are days when, I was so tired that I could only compare it to as if I were a balloon and somebody had taken all the air out, that everything was an effort, getting out of bed, doing simple tasks for, most people would just be these insurmountable mountains that I couldn't climb.
Dr. Pramod Mistry of Yale University is on the medical board of the National Gaucher Foundation.
Often there is enlarged liver and spleen, and there are low blood counts. And so when you go to a specialist who is a hematologist, an oncologist, they are likely to think about that first.
Tamara Siasi spent the first 21 years of her life misdiagnosed with everything from childhood leukemia to lupus. But Siasi didn't have either. It took looking into her ancestry to finally diagnose her correctly.
In my family, my maternal grandparents were from Foumange, France, and they date back to Napoleon. And so nobody, and the other side was Portuguese. So that was never really factored in terms of ancestry. And it wasn't until recently, in the last few years, that we discovered that my relatives, a few relatives were from Ukraine and had come over. Like, my grandfather was a month old when he was brought over to England. And on the other side, there's more family members from Ukraine that I didn't know about.
With the discovery of her Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jewish heritage, Siasi was finally diagnosed with Gaucher disease, one of the 16 so-called Jewish genetic diseases.
Because of genetic factors, the body is not able to make enough of an important enzyme in the body that we call acid beta-glucosidase. And when that enzyme is deficient, then certain fats build up inside the cells of the body. And when these fats are building up inside the cells, they can be very toxic and harmful to the cells and the organs, like the liver, the spleen, the bones, and the bone marrow. And in that setting, then it leads to enlargement of the liver, the spleen, the low blood counts, and bruising, and very extreme tiredness because of anemia. And it also leads to very severe bone complications, such as osteoporosis, fractures, and very painful infarctions of the bone that we call bone crisis. And
to learn more about Gaucher's disease, tune into the full broadcast version of The Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, laying a path for the future is one of our most basic social obligations. But are we doing a good job? When it comes to giving young people a chance with their money, we could be doing a lot better, according to CNN chief business correspondent Christine Romans, author of Smart is the New Rich, Money Guide for Millennials. And we might be doing quite a lot of damage to this generation from an educational perspective by burdening them with high-stakes standardized tests. NPR lead digital education reporter Anya Kamenetz discussed that and more in The Test, Why Our Schools Are Obsessed with Standardized Testing, But You Don't Have to Be. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Anya Kamenetz. I grew up in private schools, sending my kids to private school. I had no idea, really, that this was going on, but some of the numbers here are really shocking, that there are kids who are spending basically 1 out of every 5 days of the school year taking standardized tests. How does that even happen?
It is extremely shocking, and it's grown out of all proportion. Nobody planned it to be this way, but so No Child Left Behind Act passed in 2001, 2002, started going into effect, mandated that all public schools test all children in 3rd through 8th grades, plus once in high school in math and reading. Those are the federally required tests, but on top of those test requirements, the states and the districts have piled on lots of diagnostic, benchmarking, and interim types of tests just to see how they're doing on the high-stakes tests. And so that's where you get this figure that between 20 and 30 tests a year are being given to kids. And then you look at the prep time that goes into it, the special after-school time, sometimes Saturday school. It really is adding up in a way that it defines the experience of public school for so many kids.
Right, and it's not just that these are 20 or 30 tests. Some of these tests are multi-day tests. So you're talking about like one of the 20 or 30 tests could be 3 days long.
Well, but the state tests in particular, you do have 3 days for math and then 3 days for English. They give the test in the morning. A lot of the kids get double time because they have ADD or other things. Then the afternoon, that one principal told me, the kids are so burnt. They're burnt out. They can't do anything else the rest of the day. So it's a lot of learning time, a lot of disruption that happens. You see it really in the high schools. It's huge because the kids taking exit exams, oftentimes they're retaking them 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 times. And it really takes up so much of the school year, especially in schools where lots of kids are struggling.
And like so many other policies that have caused a lot of discord, we find that this is a policy that was launched with an assumption that it was scientific, but the science was belying it almost at precisely the time they put it in place. In the 90s, we were hearing about how bad the SAT was as a predictor of performance in college. And it seems like the policy was basically, well, it's not working there. Let's double down on it for every kid in America as much as possible.
It's so interesting that you say that. I do find repeatedly that there's this disconnect between education policy learning and the science of measurement. So psychometricians, the people that make up these tests, they're not learning specialists, they're not cognitive specialists, they don't know how to learn. They can just tell you within a certain level of precision whether you've gotten these concepts right or wrong, but it's really such a small sample of behavior that we're using then to make these really big proclamations. And I think the root of that is there was a political consensus going on for a long time that our schools are failing, that kids are being left behind. And the way to get out of that would be to propose some kind of balanced measurement that we give everybody the same thing. And that was a very seductive idea, but the science just didn't measure up.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowa Uplink Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.